This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the Tim Gill Center for Public Media here in Colorado Springs. In Colorado, it is snowing for the first time. We're in the foot of the Rockies, and we're in one of the most heavily militarized areas of this country, area of bases, military bases for the Army, for the Air Force. We continue our conversation with Dave Phillips, investigative reporter and author. In 2009, he wrote the award-winning two-part series called Casualties of War for the Colorado Springs Gazette. Lethal Warriors, When the New Band of Brothers Came Home, is his new book, which shows how a wave of violence swept across Colorado Springs when the 506th Infantry Regiment, known as the Band of Brothers, returned home from their first tour in Iraq. The Band of Brothers had been deployed to the most violent places in Iraq, and some of the soldiers continued suffering from what they had seen and done in combat, even after leaving the battlefield. Without much time to recover, they were sent back to the front lines. After their second tour of duty, the battalion was renamed the Lethal Warriors, since the soldiers once again brought the violence home. Also joined by Andrew Pogany, who is a veteran of the Iraq War, and by Graham Clumpner, who served in Afghanistan and now part of Iraq Veterans Against the War, who's organized with a number of others an Afghanistan retreat, the first of its kind for Iraq Veterans Against the War. They're gathering in Denver. Andrew Pogany, you served in Iraq when?
I was in Iraq in 2003.
In 2003. This was the first year of the U.S. invasion.
Correct.
You are now a counselor, a psychologist working?
No, I'm not a counselor. I'm a veterans advocate. I've worked as a veterans advocate on the national level since my retirement from the Army in 2007. And that work has been combined with investigative work, which is what is part of my training as a professional. So that's what I am. I have a colleague, my colleague who I do this work with. He is a counselor.
What are you finding?
We're finding that the system is very ill-equipped, and that the system is also not adapting, and the system is not changing. One of the things I want to add up front is that we don't have a political position on this. We don't approach any of these issues from the position of whether, the conflict is correct or we should be there or should not be there. Our only concern is that there is an epidemic that is brewing, and it manifests itself mainly in suicides as well as other social problems. And there are some root causes that need to be addressed. And that's what we advocate on. Those are the types of cases that we investigate, and we try to bring them to the attention of senior leaders to bring about some change. We fully acknowledge that sometimes and people disagree with our position on this. Sometimes war is important. Sometimes war is necessary. We take a historical look at this. There are democracies, there are nations, there are individuals who owe their very existence to the fact that it's being done. But as a nation, we must ask ourselves the question, what is the cost of doing this business? And if we don't have an honest and open dialogue with the nation and its citizens about what this cost is, then we're failing. And that cost is not just bombs and bullets. The cost is the psychological cost, the scars, the psychological injuries borne by those who survive war, come home, and then have to reintegrate back into normal life. So part of the work that we do also is to not just help individuals, avoid the path to suicide or the path to homelessness or the path to being shoved off into some fringe group of society labeled the mentally ill. Part of our work is to make sure to give those who have honorably served this nation war an opportunity to come home and to reintegrate and to be able to fully participate in normal life.
Do you think that the mental health services here in Colorado Springs at Fort Carson are working?
They are working to an extent. There are very There's some very innovative things that have happened at Fort Carson. It's been a hard road, but Fort Carson has also, as part of the growth and the painful growth that they had to go through, they've had some very great experiences, and they've had some very innovative leaders and thinkers at Fort Carson to bring about some change. One of the things that we see as the ongoing problem is that there are players in the system that, for whatever reason they're doing what they're doing, they're not doing the right thing. And what we're referring to by saying this is that we encounter case after case after case where it's painfully obvious that there's malfeasance involved, and that starts with purposely misdiagnosing individuals and players within the system purposely.
What do you mean?
Well, we have individuals that have the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, and then when it comes to adjudicating that case, whether from an administrative standpoint or from a medical standpoint, specifically when it comes to affording the individual an opportunity to exit the military, those diagnoses are being changed. They're being changed to diagnoses that don't carry disability ratings, don't carry benefits, and when you change someone's diagnosis, not only is it unethical and immoral, but you're preventing them from receiving the proper and appropriate care. So if you have someone who has post-traumatic stress disorder and then they're fraudulently diagnosed as having an adjustment disorder, it's to us that's it's a very, very serious problem, because for one, you're denying them the proper and appropriate care that they need. Number two is you're causing what is commonly referred to as betrayal trauma. Betrayal trauma is the social component of PTSD. You have an individual who has served, has an experience in combat, they come home with a combat-related injury, an invisible injury, and now you're telling them that they're just somehow mentally ill. And it's wrong on every single level. Not to mention that from the clinical standpoint, if you look at the DSM-4, which is the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, that is the book to help facilitate mental health diagnoses, it clearly states that, for example, if an individual has an Axis 1 diagnosis, such as PTSD, then giving the diagnosis of adjustment disorder is inappropriate. And we've tracked this pattern for years now. In the beginning, it was diagnosing individuals with PTSD and traumatic brain injuries as having personality disorders. Then the next thing was the adjustment disorder. Then it was anxiety disorder, NOS. The new trend that we see now is all of a sudden individuals have somatoform disorder. I mean,
somatoform?
Somatoform disorder, which is absurd. It is really, really absurd. So recently, for example, there was a scandal at Joint Base Lewis McChord where it was uncovered
in Washington State
that providers were changing individuals' diagnoses and denying the diagnosis of PTSD. When that came into the news cycle, I received calls and I was asked the question, what do you think about this? And I said that while this is tragic, this is not newsworthy. Why? Because this has been going on for years. I was involved in an investigation at Fort Carson in 2008 where we identified a provider who admitted that they were purposely misdiagnosing so they don't have to pay benefits. So this is an ongoing problem, and it is one of the root causes that ultimately leads people to commit suicide. So this notion that that Johnny comes home and somehow committed suicide because he couldn't balance his checkbook or he had relationship problems, that is only one aspect. And that might be the trigger that caused them to commit suicide. But nobody looks at the path to suicide. Suicide is not something that happens, at the drop of a dime. People don't wake up in the morning and say to themselves, what am I going to do today? Commit suicide? Well, that sounds like a good idea. No, people get on a path that continuously deteriorates their mental state, and at some point in time, they are so compromised that because of the emotional pain, possible physical pain that they're suffering, they see no other way out than to take their own lives.
There was a suicide just at the beginning of the year.
Correct.
What happened here?
Well, there was an individual who took his own life by crashing his vehicle into a light pole, tree, fence kind of combination and then as a result of the vehicle accident, he ended up passing away. And it was a suicide. The individual posted on Facebook he was going to do that. And the reason that particular case is very relevant to us right now, because we have a case right now, which is this one actually takes the cake as far as we're concerned. On the eve and on the heel of the Army's National Suicide Prevention Stand Down, in response to the rising numbers of what we call or consider catastrophic amounts of suicide and an epidemic that is, equivalent to a public health crisis, we get a case where an individual who has attempted to kill himself.
This was this past May.
This past May. An individual who attempted to kill himself in the same manner by crashing his vehicle into an object. Now that individual is being recommended and considered for an administrative separation from the military without benefits as a result of misconduct. When we reviewed the file, the misconduct that they're referring to is the actual suicide attempt. So we're stunned, we're baffled that leaders would say that, we're trying to prevent suicides, we're trying to work on the issue of stigma and address stigma, and then behind closed doors we have these types of cases. Now, is this prevalent across the board? Probably not, but there's a certain percentage that this is happening to, and there's a certain percentage. When you look at numbers across the board, it's always kind of like the same percentage.
So this young man who attempted to kill himself, now the Army's response is to sever him from the military without benefits.
Correct.
You yourself, Andrew Pogany, you served in Iraq. You were then court-martialed?
I was not. I was brought up on some charges, on some fabricated charges by my command. I was wrongfully, my command wrongfully attempted to prosecute me for something that they alleged happened, but it didn't happen, and ultimately the case was very quickly dismissed, so it never got to the point where it entered a courtroom.
What did you learn from this, and what year was it?
This was also in 2003. It started in 2003. The case was closed in 2004. What I learned from that is that, I learned various things from that. One, to stand up and fight for myself, and I also learned that there's certain things within a system that may or may not work to an individual's benefit, and that when the system closes in and has an agenda, it can become very difficult for an individual to survive that. Myself, I was close to not surviving what was happening to me, but luckily I had a support system that I was able to rely on to make sure that I did come out on the other end.
Andrew, the case, even though it was thrown out, it is extremely important, I think. You were the first American soldier since the Vietnam War to be charged with what they call cowardice.
Correct.
For what? Explain actually what took place in your first nights in Iraq.
I had a psychological breakdown, which was induced by toxic levels of an anti-malaria drug that we were administered. So the toxic levels of the drug caused practically a malfunction in the brain, and it caused me to have both auditory and visual hallucinations, and it caused me to not be able to function. And when I approached my command and requested and sought medical help, they didn't see it that way initially.
You also saw an Iraqi killed.
Yes, there was an individual who
What happened to him?
He was shot by the main gun of a Bradley. I didn't witness the actual shooting. I saw the aftermath.
Which was?
Which was an individual hit by the main gun of a Bradley fighting vehicle.
Which means he was?
He was very much disintegrated. It was a very grotesque view. But not anything that, wasn't something that was that bizarre or grotesque. I had seen similar things previously in my life. So in response to me seeking medical help, my command, in their infinite wisdom, they sought to court-martial me. Later
Cowardice is a charge punishable by death?
Correct. So that, was a sobering reality to me.
But what does cowardice mean?
It just means cowardly conduct before the enemy, which didn't even apply in my case.
Which came from you appealing to your superiors, to your commanding officer?
And asking for medical help. And then within 2 weeks of the charge being brought, the charge was actually dismissed. And then it was replaced with another charge, which was called willful dereliction of duty, which subsequently, about 30 days after that, was also dismissed. And then the case just lingered for about 9 months. And then the case was ultimately closed, and the U.S. Army Special Operations Command, which I was a member of, they admitted that, you know, the anti-malaria drugs that they've given me had contributed to to what happened. And I wasn't the only one. By the time I was done, we found out that within the Special Operations community, there were at a minimum 12 individuals who had pretty much the same types of reactions and side effects from this particular drug. This drug is known to the medical community to cause problems. It's a black label drug. And today, out of those 10 or 12 individuals that have been identified, myself and another guy are actually the only ones that are still alive. Everybody else has committed suicide.
Everyone else has committed suicide. How many?
There's about 10 individuals.
Out of how many?
Out of the 12 that we, in our investigation, have, you know, connected to having severe side effects of this drug.
Wait, I think a lot of people right now who are listening, who are watching, who will read this will be shaking their heads. Say again?
Within the Special Operations community where I worked, we, in the course of several years, we identified roughly 12 individuals, I think it's 12 or 14 individuals, I'd have to go back and look at the numbers, that have had documented severe side effects from the anti-malaria drug called Lariam that we were given. Out of those individuals, at a minimum 10 have committed suicide as a result of side effects.
Graham Clumpner, Afghan war vet.
I think this is a larger, you know, his story is a microcosm of a larger problem, and that is the fact that the women and men who joined the United States military are referred to as GIs. GI means government issue, and that means that just like your helmet and your rifle, you are a piece of equipment. And so the way that the military looks at it from a healthcare perspective, as you're an active duty soldier or military member, is that if you're broken, you can't give them what they need from you. So the military's healthcare is essentially trying to keep that piece of equipment working another 6 months, duct tape it, if you will. And then they toss you aside, especially now, because what we're going through is a downturn in the number of total contractors and active duty personnel in the military. So we're looking at a situation where people are being pushed out. Minor drug offenses, marijuana. You know, you can go down to a dispensary here in Colorado Springs right down the street and purchase marijuana as a civilian. But if you're a soldier that gets caught with some marijuana on you, they will push you out of the military and ruin the rest of your life. So on a personal level, as I served in the military, there was numerous examples of you know, family problems being not an issue to anybody in your chain of command. Personal relationships with a spouse, you know, car trouble. The simplest things that you would think a community that we talk about when, you know, we say band of brothers. And it's not just a band of brothers, it's a band of sisters and brothers now. And we are looking at a world where we're asking these people to go sacrifice and come home and shut up and not talk about it. And just go stay in their rooms, and once in a while we'll put a little bumper sticker on our car, we'll have a little yellow ribbon. But that's the extent of the conversation that we want to have. So we heard earlier about this feeling of betrayal. And it's really important to talk about trauma in terms of betrayal. Now, you can have an IED go off or a rocket attack, and you can have 40 people in a platoon there, and maybe only 5 of them are the ones whose brains don't heal from that. 30 days later, the other 35 may be relatively fine. But we can't exactly figure it out. But we do see a parallel between people trusting their command, trusting their president, trusting the American people to make a proper choice about where and when we use these tools of war. And let's be completely transparent. If you serve in the United States military, your first, last, and only job is to take the life, or as we call it in the military, close with and kill the enemy. If you are in the military, you are serving that purpose. And I think we are missing a larger conversation here, because look at who's on this panel. We have 3 white men who have had experience on some level in a relatively white community here in Colorado Springs. And the violence that we are participating in, whether actively or passively, is not being done to people, it's being done to people of color from other nations. And we are in a situation where we never talk about those people. I mean, I can come home and go to the VA, okay? I can remove myself from the source of my trauma. People in Afghanistan and Iraq and all of these other countries where we're dropping drone or having drone strikes, they cannot remove themselves from the source of their trauma. They do not have a Veterans Administration. In a lot of cases, they don't have access to basic health care. And we lose sight of having that conversation every time we sit down and talk about this. So I think it's very important that we acknowledge that this is larger than just an American problem.
Amy, I want to add something to what he just talked about, specifically when it comes to the conduct of soldiers when they come home. There is a percentage of soldiers who engage in various activities that the military labels as misconduct, such as alcohol-related offenses, drinking, substance abuse, drug-related offenses. Those are misconduct in the military. So the process of helping those who come home and need help and need appropriate care should not be confused with diminishing or degrading a system of accountability within the military. The military heavily depends on what is commonly referred to as the good order and discipline of the military. And all of us in my field where I work, we acknowledge that. The problem that we encounter is that you have an individual who, for example, as a result of not being able to receive the proper and appropriate treatment or individually tailored treatment that they need, they resort to things like self-medicating. The science has proven, research has proven that this is a fact. Alcohol abuse or substance abuse, depression, those are the most concomitant diagnoses with PTSD. What we are faced with is we're faced with an archaic military justice system that has not adapted, even though their own research, their own military law reviews show that PTSD and substance abuse related misconduct are closely related, that there's a nexus, that one comes from the other. And what we're addressing is we're not asking the military to not have people held accountable for misconduct. If you need to go ahead and punish someone because they illegally or in violation of regulation used illegal substances, go ahead and punish them. Punish them within the system. But that doesn't mean that you have to go to the extent of imposing administrative sanctions that have an impact on the rest of their life, such as taking away all their benefits and then putting that person without a safety net out into the community, where they then become a problem in my community. And all they do is they end up draining the resources of my community. And that can be within the criminal justice system, homelessness, domestic violence, child abuse, and the list goes on and on and on. So there needs to be, when it comes to addressing the issue of stigma, there needs to be really a revamping of how the system administers punishment for misconduct and then subsequently administrative action in order to eliminate those individuals from service. And we feel it is morally and ethically wrong to deprive those who have honorably served this nation in war of the benefits that they have earned, that this country has legislated that they should be getting.
We have to break, but we're going to come back to this discussion. Our guest, Dave Phillips, author of Lethal Warriors, When the New Band of Brothers Comes Home. And I want to talk more about this. You're just returning to revisit some of the stories of the people you covered in this remarkable both series, first for the Gazette here in Colorado Springs and now as a book. Andrew Pogany with us, an Iraq War vet, now a counselor for soldiers returning home, and Graham Clumpner with Iraq Veterans Against the War. He's drove in from Denver because this weekend, starting today, is the first Afghanistan retreat. He's an Afghan war vet. that Iraq Veterans Against the War are putting on, a gathering nationally. This is Democracy Now! We're broadcasting from Colorado Springs in our 100 City tour. Stay with us.